5 there. Good evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I know there's a few people still coming in with our afternoon rainfall. I'm John Sarpa. I'm the chairman of the Community Forum at the Aspen Institute. Welcome this evening, actually this afternoon. And this is the fourth event for our series of public talks, the future of transportation and mobility in the Roaring Fork Valley. Hopefully some of you have been to some of the previous ones. I want to thank the sponsors, as we always should do to begin with, City of Aspen, Pitkin County, and the town of Snowmass Village. I might add the Institute itself, too, has helped get this started. Tonight, before our co-chair, Bill Kane, introduces our special guest from right here in the Valley, I'll give you a little bit background about what is this forum and, more importantly, what is this group on transportation and mobility. Several discussions were held some time ago with community members approached the Institute and said, we've got a transportation problem, in this community. It's been here for quite a few decades. Can we finally convene a group, talk seriously about what's being done, cutting edge, if you will, in our country, and what could be done in terms of our transportation and mobility on the upper end of the Roaring Fork Valley? The objective of this task force is pretty straightforward, and that is to develop an overall vision for our valley of what we should look like in 20 years, so in the year roughly 2035, with respect to transportation and mobility, focusing on quality of life, environmental sustainability, air quality, and social equity. The Institute took this on, and the process is pretty straightforward. We decided to bring together a series of really the best people we can find, and through the Institute resources, it's a pretty broad net we can throw. Who are the best thinkers, the best planners, the best developers, if you will, of these concepts today around our country, and indeed around the globe, on transportation and mobility? What's going on out there? What can we learn from them? And what might we bring here to this valley to learn from others? Our S-curves and everything else have been discussed ad nauseum, so rather than get hung up on those details, we're not talking about traffic lights at Cemetery Lane with our group. We're really looking at a set of values. Who are we as a community? What do we value as a community? And how are those values then, or how should those values be reflected in how we get around, how we interact with each other, how we get to and from the places that are important to us. We've had 4 of these events, and tonight we're going to have Greg Rucks from Rocky Mountain Institute just down the road. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Kane, and he'll introduce Greg to you.
Stairs are really a wonderful experience. I had a big crash on Aspen Mountain this winter and learning to climb stairs again. This is a great treat for us to introduce Greg Rucks. Our group, our forum, has been working diligently since last, I think, September. And we've had a variety of speakers. Maybe some of you have been fortunate enough to hear some of our folks. Greg came to speak to us probably 4 or 5 months ago, and we were comfortably tracking on a lot of our comfortable assumptions. And then Greg, being an exponent of Rocky Mountain Institute, a very benign but totally effective disruptor, came and really kind of turned our thinking upside down, and in an extraordinarily positive and really fun way. So this is a treat to introduce Greg. For those of you that didn't get to hear him in our forum group, this will be a wonderful experience for you to hear some of this innovative thinking that's happening in Houston and Austin and places that are confronting transportation problems on a larger scale, but that fundamentally they're kind of the same issues that we have. So Greg's got a terrific kind of educational background. He graduated from CC with a degree in English and then proceeded to move on in his educational pursuits, and went on to a bachelor's in science in English's most closely aligned field, mechanical engineering, which he did at Columbia University. So I think you'll quickly catch on that this is a guy that really got us thinking in a whole new way about travel in the valley and mobility in a broader sense. And you know, we really have, I think since Greg talked to us, now have adopted the term innovative mobility into our vocabulary. It was a little tough at first, but because we were really comfortable in our assumptions, but he really got us thinking in different ways. So I think there's a full description of all of Greg's credentials in your little handout, but we've had a wonderful time interacting with him and hope you enjoy his talk as much as we did. So Greg, with no further ado, come on up.
Thank you. Thanks for the intro. Great opportunity to be able to share some of what we've been doing in some other cities around the country. And I'll just start with the overall vision that this program is kind of geared to achieving. And then I'll come back to what's behind that vision and some of the tactics that we've developed to sort of get there. And as just one caveat, when I say we, it's a very broad we. We've reached out to a lot of industry partners, major mobility operators, cities, governments, others, and there's a really exciting convergence around some of the elements of this vision that I'll be sharing today. So the first kind of big picture piece of this different mobility paradigm relative to today's is mobility as a service. Basically, that refers to mobility that is on demand, and you can get from point A to point B using myriad different services that are seamlessly woven together. It's technology enabled, and it's multimodal, obviously, so using these different services. And then the second element is that mobility system becomes electrified and autonomous. Electrified, for reasons that you'll see in just a bit, makes a ton of sense from a business perspective and can drive a lot of adoption of the electrification of vehicles. And then autonomous because it's kind of inevitable. We're seeing incredible investment in autonomous vehicle technology by some of the biggest players in the world, including Google and Apple and Uber and others. And I'll go into more detail there. And then every single major automaker is also investing in autonomous vehicles now. So we see that as kind of an inevitability that sort of builds on this core of mobility as a service. And then the final element is around city design. So if you are able to shift to mobility as a service, as a core paradigm, and I'll go into more about what's entailed with that, what's involved with that, and then electrify and make the mobility system autonomous, it opens up dramatic new possibilities for transforming the urban landscape. You can imagine dramatically less parking and different use of vehicle-based infrastructure once you move away from a system that's based on personally owned vehicles. So those are kind of the three elements of the vision. And for Rocky Mountain Institute, I just wanted to walk through, as a mission-driven nonprofit that's really focused on transitioning off of fossil fuels, with transportation being one of the top 2 contributors to emissions worldwide, why do we care? Why do we care about this mobility paradigm? So if you kind of look at a timeline from now to 2030 on this chart, and over on the right side you have emissions from personal mobility, and that's in gigatons of CO2 per year. The World Resources Institute has established a line that we'd need to follow in order to avoid a 2 degrees Celsius global temperature increase, which is kind of the upper limit. It's even beyond the upper limit of what most scientists are saying will avoid catastrophic effects from climate change. So if we look at transportation and we keep it in today's paradigm and we do everything that we can, even at the most optimistic projections, the first of those is let's adopt electric vehicles as fast as the most aggressive predictors are saying we can in the industry. And that's 50% of sales in 2030. That's what Elon Musk thinks we could achieve at and that's at the high end. So that blue line is how much our yearly emissions from personal mobility would come down if we achieved that extremely optimistic target. The next one is travel demand reduction. So there's a lot of cities that are setting goals around reducing vehicle miles traveled as a way to address travel demand. And 30% is kind of at the upper end of what a lot of cities can achieve, especially with population growth. That's a pretty aggressive target. And if those cities achieve that 30% reduction, that's roughly the reduction in yearly emissions that you'd see. And then finally, this one is around corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE standards. And that's a government regulation that dictates how efficient vehicles need to be. And if those are achieved at the most aggressive rate that they possibly could be, by the way, these regulations are potentially not going to be continued, that's where you'd hit. So you'd fall short with today's paradigm. And so this was our kind of epiphany in establishing this program, was that if you start, and this is today's system in contrast, right? It's a system based on personal cars, personally owned vehicles that are gas-powered in cities designed for those, where a lot of the infrastructure is devoted to the vehicles. So if you start, and you can kind of think of this as a combination of a system around which technology is built and that is delivered in cities that are designed to accommodate those technologies within that system. And then you start just at the technology. So for example, if we just tried to get electric vehicles adopted as quickly as possible within today's paradigm, obviously you're not focusing on the system change that's required to really get there. So if we focus on the technology without changing the system, as we've seen from the prior chart, that falls woefully short of carbon targets, but potentially more importantly, it leaves on the table dramatic benefits to the urban form and other health-oriented and people-oriented benefits that result from this change in the system. So that's why we really came around to developing this system, which is we started with system change, which is shifting from this personally owned vehicle system to mobility as a service, and that's the core around which everything else unfolds. So with mobility as a service, instead of cars sitting unused 95% of the time, which they do today, they're utilized at rates closer to 50%, and miles on the individual vehicles accumulate much more quickly, and electric vehicles have lower fuel costs. So if you're accumulating miles more quickly, your savings are accumulated more quickly if that's an electric vehicle. And if those electric vehicles are used within a service model, you accelerate how many of those miles can be electrified and how quickly the vehicles can be introduced into service and turned over. So that's the key to accelerating electrification. And then what you see when you look at the model here is that top gray line that we saw before, which was woefully inadequate, is now sufficient to hit the World Resources Institute target and deliver a lot of the other economic and social benefits that are associated with this system that I'll go into in a little bit more detail. So that's why RMI is really focused on this from a mission perspective, and why we think mobility as a service is a core element of moving toward this future. So now the question is, if that's our vision, and we kind of set that up on the right side, the question is, how do we get there? What can we do in the near term to move us toward this future? And what we did is kind of designed a program with projects that we thought could take the first steps to getting toward that long-term vision, but that could deliver some benefit in the near term as well to kind of build momentum to getting there. So we have two projects that we designed, one around mobility as a service itself, and another one around a key element of unlocking this multimodal transit future, which is the data associated with the different modes that are available to people. And that includes paying for these modes and then being able to plan trips with them through kind of smartphone-enabled approaches or signage that indicates which of these modes are available in kind of real time. And that's a critical element to delivering the same level of convenience and reliability that people have come used to with their personally owned vehicles. So data is a core element of that as well. So now the question is, where do we focus initially? And on mobility as a service, what we're focused on right now, and what we thought would be a really good starting point, was starting with commuting. Because commuting is by far the single largest category of vehicle miles traveled. It's the highest pain point for cities trying to address congestion, because the most congested times are during peaks when people are commuting to and from work. And it's the group that is most likely to make a behavioral change, because they're sitting in traffic and they're trying to get to and from work, and they're potentially likely to adopt mobility as a service, right? Plus, the employers are sometimes willing to pay for these services or subsidize them because they can save on parking costs. Employers pay very high costs in parking very often, and even if they don't, there's a lot of benefits associated with offering commuting service benefits. So we said, okay, let's start with that, and then let's focus on the employers and try to start this shift within an arena that sees the business case and sees the value of that, and then we can expand from there to the more difficult groups as we expand out into the rest of the populace. So that's the tactical starting point for mobility as a service. Then with interoperable transit data, the question is, okay, we need better data that's associated with all modes that allows people to understand what their options are in real time. Where do we start? So we went to the industry itself, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, but there are groups that generate a lot of data. Public transit agencies are one example. They create schedule data. They create real-time data around the location of their buses, like you have right here in the valley. RAFTA has real-time information and signage that indicates when the bus is going to arrive. But right now, everybody's delivering that data in different formats, and it's really hard for companies like Google and Apple and Transit App and others to consume that data and make it available to users in a sort of user-friendly format. So we said, okay, let's just get everybody together so we can agree on some standard means of publishing the data, and then it makes it much better for the users. And that involves a consortium that we're in the process of developing right now. So those are the two pieces that we think can form the kind of starting point to get us to that long-term vision of ubiquitous mobility as a service, where you have myriad options available and bookable and payable in real time. Then the next piece, we kind of have two elements around basically the technology of the vehicles. And as I mentioned before, with mobility as a service, the utilization of the vehicles goes up, the business case for electrification gets much better, you can accelerate the degree to which you can electrify these vehicles, or electrify, apparently, in this case, which is that's a new thing. Yeah. That T is just kind of in the line. So if we focus on high mileage fleets right now, and a lot of people are probably familiar with transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, where you pull out your smartphone, enter a destination, a car comes to pick you up and takes you there. Those vehicles travel a lot of miles per year. And so it makes a lot more sense for those vehicles to electrify because they save money more quickly than a normal vehicle would. And it makes sense for them to replace their vehicle with an electric vehicle sooner. So we're working with the transportation network companies. We actually are working with Lyft and Uber to offer electric vehicles to their drivers through various lease programs or group buy programs that allow the drivers to get access to electric vehicles, which helps their pocketbooks and then also allows potentially the TNCs to charge less money to the riders. And that's what really creates that market mechanism to accelerate the adoption of these electric vehicles. Then on autonomous vehicles, the key with autonomous, we're thinking anyway, is demonstration. You know, this is still a relatively new technology. There's a dozen cities now that have demonstration pilots underway, but the key is getting people comfortable with the technology and really learning as much as we can. There's still a lot of uncertainty around consumer adoption and how it's going to work within these service models. So to state it simply, the starting point there is running some demonstration pilots. And then finally, we have this mobility-oriented development, this is cities designed for it piece. And kind of similar to autonomous vehicles, we're thinking that a demonstration of different approaches to urban form that take advantage of some of these new technologies is the key. So then consumers can become comfortable with it. Financiers and developers who are in the business of developing new urban form can see that consumers will accept it, or maybe they see that consumers don't accept it and they can make adjustments from there. But they need kind of a live demonstration of what this will actually be. How do the mobility services interact with the built environment? And how can we think about creating an urban form that's more people-oriented and that's more amenable to the advent of these new services? So we're working on a living lab that I'll go into a little bit more detail on to start to demonstrate what that new urban form could look like. So that's kind of the program in whole, and we sort of designed this program in advance by talking again with many different partners, government groups, city government, state government, and then lots and lots of private partners, Uber, Lyft, Waze, and other app developers to sort of get an overall picture of where we thought this could go. And we got, I would say, buy-in for this overall program. And then the big question was, how do we do this? Or should we do this all in one area? Should we do some of these in some parts of the country? And we considered both of those. And really, it started to feel like in order to unlock the holistic benefits of those three elements on the right over there, because there's so much overlap between them. You can imagine, for example, if we start deploying employer-sponsored commuting services, and then in that same city we're able to electrify those services, that unlocks a lot of overlap and benefit that would not accrue if we were doing them separately. And there's a relationship similar to that among all three of these pieces where they form a holistic whole. And we said, okay, we've got to choose one city and deploy all of this at once and then try to make that replicable to other cities across the country. So we ran a really extensive city selection process and chose Austin, Texas. And I won't go into too much detail about the criteria we applied, but we did kind of a quantitative process, did a bunch of research, and then the main element of it was reaching out to the cities themselves, talking to the city councils, the city government, understanding what the environment was for new businesses there, whether there was a pretty amenable environment for the advent of new technologies, all kinds of things like that, and we ended up choosing Austin. So for the last year and a half, we've actually been in Austin, and these are the 5 things that we're doing there. We have 5 projects that we're running and continuing to work on that. And a few other cities have taken sort of interest. We're also working a little bit with Denver and trying to figure out how we can scale some of our work from Austin to Denver. And then obviously there's some applicability to the Valley as well. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about how I think that might roll out. So that's the overall program. And I'm just going to go into a bit more detail on 3 pieces of this. So the fleet electrification autonomous vehicles piece that I just covered are really important, and I can go into more detail if anybody's interested. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, and in terms of what could apply most to the Valley, I selected 3 pieces of our work that I thought could apply. So we'll kind of take a deep dive into 3 different areas. And the first is this interoperable transit data work that I talked a little bit about. And this was really striking to me. This was a cover of The Economist just a couple weeks ago. It's a little blurry, but you can see Google is right at the center of this. And then you have, and obviously, you know, the overall sort of picture here is that data is this incredibly valuable resource, and that there's all these new things to figure out about how it's shared, and it's literally becoming like oil or like some kind of commodity that people are starting to realize is just incredibly valuable. So what I found particularly striking is that on a cover that's meant to just depict data as a whole, at least 3 of the companies here are mobility companies. So you got Tesla, Google, which is now a mobility company, a major player in mobility, Uber, and then Amazon is actually working to enter the mobility space as well. So with data as the world's most valuable resource, mobility is arguably one of the top applications for data and one of the greatest enablers for unlocking its full potential. So this was kind of in line with what we, I think, zeroed in on early on as a critical first piece to solve and to work towards. So this goes into a little bit more detail around transit data, in particular, public transit data. And there's a relationship between ridership and good information, as I was mentioning before. And this is just some of the research that backs that up. And across the bottom axis here, you have different categories of data. Static is basically just schedule data. When is the bus supposed to be there? And is it up to date? You know, the different seasonal changes, et cetera. That's the really basic one. But you'd be surprised how hard this one is to actually get right across the country. So there's a big increase in ridership when that data is made readily available, especially through smartphones and apps like Google Maps and Transit app and others like that. So static's the first category, but get about a 3% bump in ridership. You get another bump from real time, and that's a very conservative estimate around real time because we've talked to different sources that think real time is actually much bigger than that and a critical enabler of, again, feeling as though there's the same level of on-demand availability that people have become used to around personally owned vehicles. Predictive data, so that goes beyond real time and sort of says, based on the history of events on this day or traffic jams that are likely to occur at this time, this bus is likely to be delayed, that kind of thing. So predictive is a whole other category of data. And then booking and payment is kind of the ultimate goal that a lot of the mobility companies are, and especially companies like the mobility aggregators like Google and Apple are hoping to achieve because of the convenience factor of being able to book and pay for a trip across modes within a single app. So that just gives you a sense of why we're interested in it, why we think there's value in the near term. And this also sort of forms a roadmap for us, because we really started with static data to get that right. And this 3% bump, if you can do that nationwide, there's a really huge impact associated with that. So we've focused a lot of our early efforts on that, but envision moving across this full spectrum and across all the data categories. So this is something we've done. This is very much in the details, and don't feel like you need to read what's here necessarily, every word. But the point is that we started an industry consortium and a website called gtfs.org that actually establishes protocols and standard format for the different data pieces that are associated with public transit. And you'd be surprised how complicated it gets. This is just one example of the way that stop name, and this is the recommendation that's made to the transit agencies. So these represent the best practices for how you publish data that adheres to particular practices around how you name a stop. So we get down into that level of detail to say, everybody needs to agree down to these kinds of details to allow Google and others to unlock the value and bring riders to your service. So if you deliver data in this format, the value proposition is you will get more riders. And that was what the prior chart was kind of showing. So transit agencies are pretty savvy to this, and they've all said to us at first, they said, well, there's no central authority. There's no one who's agreeing on what this standard is. And I don't want it to be Google, because then they'll do it in a way that kind of benefits them. So they needed a neutral party who could come in and provide sort of a friendly forum where we could all agree on this and build critical mass. And of course, a mission-driven nonprofit like Rocky Mountain Institute was in a really good position to do that. So we created this consortium, and the first thing we did was create best practices around, GTFS, that stands for General Transit Feed Specification. And that's the standard by which this data can be published. So kind of in the details, but once we establish the standards for public transit data, we can expand to other modes. So across here, you see all different modes: station-based mass transit, flexible mass transit, which is like on-demand shuttles, which I'll be talking a little bit more about, shared, so car sharing systems, free-floating shared, that's another form of car sharing, and then TNCs, which is Uber and Lyft. And we have a pretty extensive database of recommendations that we've made for which type of data should be made available to the users. And this is all user-centric. So we kind of walk through this and think about, does a user need to know these different pieces of information? They might not call it this, but these are critical for delivering reliable service. And then we kind of establish why it's important over here. And again, this is the broad we. We reached out to publishers of data, consumers of data, and kind of agreed on this. So this is the big vision, is to move toward a future in which all this data is readily available and is being published according to standard protocols that allow companies to consume that data and make it available to users. And there's much more detail on this in a report we did. So this is the consortium that we started. So Google and Apple are kind of our some of our anchor tenants, and they're some of the most interested companies in this because it's going to save them a ton of work if the data is coming in at higher quality. They actually catch flack, so if the public transit data is incorrect or if it's in a form that needs a lot of scrubbing and then the user ends up with data that's incorrect, they blame Google. They don't blame the transit agency. So Google's saying, all right, we're catching a lot of heat for this, and we want to get away from a model where we're reaching out to individual transit agencies to say, give me your data. We want to move to a model where everyone's doing it the same and it's easier for us to consume that data. There's a ton of value across this chain for all these companies. So those are our two kind of anchor consortium members. We're working, this is our technical partner, Trillium Transit. They do a lot of work with public transit agencies. And then others that you may recognize here. Transit App obviously has a partnership with WeCycle here that allows seamless booking of and reservation of bikes from public transit stops. And it's a fully integrated app that allows for you don't have to use a membership card to check the bike out. And that's the first time that's happened in the country. So Transit App is doing that here in the Valley. MapsIn publishes a global database of transit feeds. So they're kind of a big partner for us in terms of accessing all those different transit feeds and making them available. And then obviously you've got a whole slew of public transit agencies down here that we're working with. And this list is really growing because these guys see a ton of value in us bringing in more of these. The more public transit agencies adopt these standards, the more value accrues to these companies up here, and this one over here too. So that's what we're doing with interoperable transit data. That's a little less geared to Austin, as you can tell. This is more of kind of a naturally nationwide approach that we think is applicable to transit agencies and then eventually other mobility companies nationwide and ultimately worldwide. So we're right in the midst of creating this consortium. And that's kind of the summary for interoperable transit data. And then if you think of the data as being kind of the foundation for mobility as a service, allowing people to discover these different services, now we can think about what we do with mobility as a service itself. So this is in Austin. These are pilots that we're running in Austin. And this always struck me. This is actually a picture that one of my colleagues took in a subway in New York. And this is Lyft, which is the second biggest transportation network company in the world after Uber. And they're showing these pink lines that are kind of saying, hey, look, we're an extension of the New York City subway system. We're an extension of public transit. We have on-demand ability to pick up people from transit stops and get them all the way that last mile to their home. And they really market this pretty heavily. So there's a ton of value that the TNC companies see in integrating their services with public transit and being an extension of public transit. And that wasn't always the case. They kind of build themselves as a point-to-point service, and now they're really seeing themselves as more of an integrated, part of an integrated multimodal network. So what we did in Austin was to say, well, why don't we take that first last mile idea and look for a place where people currently have a gap to public transit, which is a particular neighborhood in around 6th and Lamar in downtown Austin. There's a bunch of employers there that are about a quarter to a half a mile away from the nearest transit stop. And some of the surveys that were run by some of our partners early on indicated that people would take public transit more if it weren't for that last mile gap. And this is often cited as one of the biggest challenges to people riding public transit is this last mile problem. So we chose to just dig into this problem and figure it out. And the first thing we had to do, which hasn't really been solved fully, at least when we started, it hadn't been, which is getting a lot of different employers to work with one another to deliver a service to their employees. And obviously the benefit is that they unlock some cost efficiency, and the service is much better, tends to be much better because it can have more vehicles and run more frequencies and kind of reach a critical mass where people want to use it. But in general, most of the companies that, actually not even in general, I think almost across the board, companies that have commuting services right now do it on a one-off basis. So Whole Foods will contact a mobility provider who runs a shuttle and then say, I want something for my employees. They haven't aggregated their services together. So we were thinking, okay, to scale this up, we should really figure out how to get these employers to work with one another. So that's what we did. We went and reached out to these different employers, and one of our partners in Austin called Movability, which is the Transportation Management Association in the city, had already done some work on this. They had done a ton of work on this, actually, to bring these different employers together. And they all said, yeah, we're all in proximity to one another. We all want mobility services. We'll all get cheaper prices. We'll all get higher frequencies. This makes a ton of sense. Let's do it. Well, we learned why it was so challenging later on, and I'll get to that in a second. But we stepped in and kind of said, okay, let's be the sort of go-between, again, this sort of neutral party. We weren't trying to sell anything. We weren't trying to get them to buy a service. We were the go-between from the people who were trying to sell it, and we were just delivering what we thought was the best product for them. So there's kind of a trusted position that we took in between those who were consuming the service and those who were selling the service. So we did an RFP, a request for proposal, and we solicited a proposal from various mobility providers kind of across the country, and we got a lot of responses. These companies are really hungry to deliver their services because a lot of them are trying to figure out this integration with public transit. They're excited by the market potential of commuting. They all see it as this big piece of the pie. So we got tremendous response to this RFP. In fact, too many responses really to choose the best one. There were so many good responses, it was actually hard to choose. So we solicited those proposals. Then we evaluated those proposals and went back to the employers to have them, we kind of made a recommendation, and then they chose the final provider, which in this case was Chariot. And Chariot had been doing work in San Francisco. They weren't in any other markets in the US yet. They were in San Jose and San Francisco, I think were the only two. So Austin was their third market as a result of responding to this RFP, and they've since expanded to 100 shuttles in downtown Austin. So there's pretty ubiquitous availability. At least soon there will be ubiquitous availability of those Chariot shuttles, and they have about 16 right now. So that was the role that we kind of played, and it was a pretty heavy lift, right? For us to step in and create this service, launch it. We did a lot of promotion and marketing. We walked through the whole thing. And I'll get to how we see that as being scalable, because obviously we can't go do that on a one-off basis over and over again. But anyway, this is a visual of the route. The red dots are the employers that we work to aggregate. So that's the 6th and Lamar area in downtown Austin. And then you have Republic Square, which runs a lot of BRT buses. That's a major transit hub. And then there's one farther over that runs the Red Line train at the convention center. So this circulator is still running in downtown Austin. It was launched by Whole Foods, and Whole Foods and GSD&M were kind of 2 anchor tenants for the service. But now it runs across multiple employers, and it's being subsidized by multiple employers, and it's running on a continuous basis. And as I mentioned, there's going to be more frequency and more shuttles running. So that was kind of the basis. We wanted to solve this aggregation issue. If we can get these employers to work together, that'll be scalable across the country, because then other employers will be able to scale. We were really excited about the fact that Whole Foods is involved, because they have locations across the country. And then we thought, okay, how do we actually make this a replicable process so that we're not going in and doing this heavy lift each time? One more thing, yeah. So not only, this is just the complication that emerges with transportation uniquely. I think it's that you have this peak commuting service. So that's what the route in the red is what you see in this next map. So this route right here, this circulator that connects people to these transit stops, runs at peak hours. So the idea there is that you would come in the morning at a normal time, leave in the evening at a normal time. And that's what this red route is over here. And what we realized, though, and this is really critical, this was the second big learning piece of this whole pilot, was that in addition to a peak commuting service, we actually have to offer sort of just-in-case trips. So if you agree that you're going to come to work at 9 in the morning, a lot of people, and the surveys indicate this is universal, they're like, yeah, but what if I need to leave for lunch, or what if I want to go work out at like 2 p.m., or what if something happens? And most of the time that doesn't happen, but if you can provide that sort of peace of mind to say, hey, there are options available in case those things happen, that's a huge driver of the adoption of these services. So that was a critical learning piece for us in terms of driving additional adoption. So we worked with these 3 companies to provide what we called on-demand or just-in-case service to the employees. And they have sort of a package of services that's available to them now, and they get discounted access to these 3 pieces. And so Car2Go is a car sharing, a free-floating car share service that runs these vehicles in Austin. They're actually started in Austin. And then B-Cycle is like WeCycle. It's a bike share system. And then these 2 are transportation network companies. So these are the equivalent of Uber and Lyft. And Uber and Lyft actually left the city of Austin, but just recently returned for various reasons. And we made rides, kind of emergency ride home almost, but a step above that in terms of availability and how many rides they could take. And that was key to driving adoption of the service. And we're seeing continued growth in ridership. It's pretty slow. It's really hard to get people aware of the service. It's really hard to kind of make that shift. But we're seeing more and more riders coming on and more people opting to use it the majority of their trips during the week. So that unlocks the parking benefits for the employers and starts to drive adoption even more. And this is one of the reasons that Chariot is expanding their footprint in Austin. So then we said, okay, that was a lot of work, as I was saying before. It was a big lift, right? We walked through every single step of the process. We did promotion and marketing. We did route design. We did an RFP to bring in these different providers. How can we make this scalable? So this is our main focus right now, and this is a concept that we're calling mobility marketplace. This is kind of a noisy slide, but the idea is that on the left here you have demand for mobility services, and this would be various sizes of employers. And in our first pilot, we figured out how to aggregate those employers. So we said, okay, we've kind of got that part figured out, and contract negotiation was another big part too. But anyway, we can aggregate these different employers, and then on the right side, you have the people who want to sell their services, and they're really motivated. Every single one of those mobility providers wants to give their mobility service to these employers. But what they're doing right now is reaching out to them directly and saying, hey, I want to give you access to bike share. Or, hey, I want to give you free rides in a TNC vehicle. But it's not integrated into anything that people would see as a comprehensive set of services. So that packaging is incredibly important. And we think that this marketplace can be the way that they can do that. So this would give these guys a forum to work together to say, hey, let's create a comprehensive package together, whether it's a first last mile solution in combination with public transit or these on-demand options that we can work with, and then we can offer packages, and we think that's critical. And then, of course, over here, you get the economic benefits of aggregation. And in the middle is kind of where we would come into play. And we're looking at different models for this, an online portal where employers can log on and see what types of packages are available from the mobility providers. We have RFP templates that sort of streamline the process, the transaction process. We even have events where we allow the mobility providers to directly interact with groups of employers who need services, and we even have like some kind of design process for delivering some of the packages, and we can facilitate all that. So we're working through some different models for this. We're right in the middle of it. Actually, we're in the process of reaching out to a bunch of employers to really get a sense of what they would find most helpful as a first step, because there's a lot of different pieces we could start with. So that's what we're working on with the mobility marketplace, and we're really excited that it's maybe on the cusp of being something that could be expanded outside of Austin, but we will start it in Austin. With these will be Austin employers and then providers that are available in Austin, but see this as being hopefully a nationwide and ultimately global model. Okay, and then the final deep dive here is around mobility-oriented development, which I talked a little bit about before, which is this demonstration environment for trying out new ways of creating the urban form that is more amenable to these new services and that allows for testing and experimentation and verification that there will be consumer demand for modifying the urban form in a way that we think is possible as these new technologies become available. So this just gives you an idea. This is an illustration from a really cool group called the Congress for the New Urbanism. And they do a lot of really imaginative work around what cities could look like if you removed vehicle storage. So you'll notice, this picture shows no parking and is kind of maybe a depiction of what maximizing space for people could start to look like. And we're working with that organization to make sure that we're using all the latest techniques that are available from built environment practitioners who are already thinking along these lines. But we still see a need for somehow creating a place where you can modify this layout and try it again and run iterations and figure out what really works and see what people respond to and what's best for human health and what's best for people. And that's not something, amazingly, and if anybody knows otherwise, let me know. But I don't think that's anything that's happening right now, so we're in the process of stepping in to offer that. And there's a really interesting near-term approach that can be taken to this. One of our biggest challenges for the built environment was, if you think about the services industry, mobility services, you can try a new version of a mobility service within a few days because it's like a new version of software. In fact, Uber and Lyft come up with new versions of software like every 3 days. They're like, let's try this Uber pool thing where people can share, and in a matter of weeks, they just roll it out because there's no capital, there's no entrenched investments to sort of shift. And then the vehicle industry is the next slowest, if you will, or the next fastest. But vehicle design cycles run about 5 years. And then if you look at the built environment, product design cycles are like, if you look at the equivalent of product design cycles for the built environment, it's decades. So you have a lot of risk aversion within the built environment and an inability in general to run fast iteration loops in terms of what the overall urban form looks like. And that's what we're trying to crack right now with this concept. So anyway, one way to run these shorter iteration design loops is to just temporarily reclaim a part of the city. So you can see that this was a street. This is a rail car that would normally run through here. And someone just put a light post there and they threw some grass up here and said, how would people use it? And this is the kind of thing that built environment practitioners can come and look at and say, oh my gosh, there are people that would want to use this. We could reclaim the space from vehicles. If we did create buildings with less parking or less accommodation of the vehicles, or we thought about loading zones and unloading zones for particular modes of transit, we could really drive a lot of adoption. And there's, by the way, tremendous health benefits that emerge from this and livability and better communities. So this is something that's happening worldwide. There's kind of an explosion of these kinds of experiments happening right now. So that's what we think could be a near-term approach. And I just have a few examples of this. This is a really famous example. So Times Square in New York looked like this about 10 years ago. And through a combination of short experiments that looked more like this, that happened on like weekends and particular days of the week, they eventually got approval, and the Urban Transportation Commission eventually moved to creating a complete flip in terms of the space that's allocated to vehicles versus people. Because when they looked at the data, in terms of throughput in Times Square, about 90% of the traffic was pedestrian and 10% was vehicles, but the space was the opposite. 90% of the space was allocated to vehicles that were only constituting 10% of the throughput. So they said, let's flip the math. Let's create a lot more space for pedestrians. Obviously, this is a pedestrian hotspot in a way, and we could create a much more amenable environment. So this is one of the most often cited examples for transforming urban landscapes and unlocking some of the benefits around pedestrianism. And by the way, the businesses that are around Times Square have seen tremendous increases in sales tax revenue as a result of higher sales, because people just move a little more slowly through these zones and do a lot more shopping. There's a lot of economic benefit. So that can be an economic driver for the direction we're moving in. Here's one other example in Barcelona, where at first you can see like trucks and cars and every manner of transportation was coming through every single part of the grid, and they've moved toward this superilles model or superblocks model, where they route major transit vehicles around the outside of a 9-block zone and then reclaim the interior only for the freight vehicles would run only at off-peak times when people are asleep. And so you wouldn't sort of impede on people's ability to come out and use that space. And then a lot more multimodal options available on the interior. And then, of course, people who live there can still come in. So it's not a prohibition of those vehicles, but it's a decrease in throughput that allows walking and biking and other modes to proliferate a little bit more. And here's just an example of what would happen with the space. So once you reclaim that space, this is within the interior of a superblock, there's different basketball courts and games being set up. There's a completely different use of the urban space. And this is just the beginning of this model. We've got our eye on this and seeing kind of what different things people will come out and use the space for. Okay, so this gets into the big picture for Mod City. This is the big picture. So this is kind of wacky land in terms of the ideas that we're exploring here. We haven't confirmed a lot of this, but this is an overhead picture of the Black Rock Desert, and people are probably aware of the Burning Man Festival, where an entire city is put up within a matter of weeks and then dismantled. Everything you see there is dismantled, and there's almost zero trace of that city having existed. So if that can work in terms of setting up a people-oriented community on a temporary basis, why don't we use that as maybe a model for what we're talking about with this modular city concept? And we're in the process of getting funding for this experimental sort of platform and looking for a place in Austin where we can do something similar to this. It wouldn't be nearly as big. And the other arena that we're looking at is festivals, because festivals set up temporary structures very, very quickly, and you can at least get a sense of whether people would enjoy that space. You can see how they interact with it and also talk to them about whether it's an enjoyable place to be, tie it to health outcomes and things like that, and then use that as the basis for city code writers who are, I would say, in need of verification of changing the city codes to allow different approaches to urban form, and then financiers and developers who tend to have, as I mentioned, that high risk aversion because of the long timelines associated with trying out different approaches. So that's just a way of kind of conceptualizing, not that we're going to do this in exactly this form, but there's some different sources of inspiration for creating this modifiable urban environment. And then it might look like, this is just one sense of kind of what this could look like, but it would be, imagine it being modifiable, imagine us deploying mobility services within this environment to understand what urban form would be most compatible with those mobility services and how people would respond to it. And then I wanted to just end with sparking a little bit of thinking here on what we could see coming. And these are just a few examples of the vehicles this is an ideal illustration, so these aren't real vehicles, but as we move toward autonomy and you get rid of steering wheels and you start facing seats in toward the center of the vehicle and not out elsewhere, and people start doing different things within the vehicles while they're moving, et cetera, there's just an explosion of innovation going on in this right now, and you can imagine how these different vehicles would interact with the urban environment in a very different way, not on traditional streets, not with traditional street widths, not with a sidewalk and a street. And why do we dedicate the street to a temporary use of vehicles and then never use it for people? And autonomous vehicles are aware of where the people are. We can rethink the street, rethink the sidewalk. So this is just a way of kind of envisioning what this could look like. And the issue, with Mod City, what we're excited about is we can bring in some of the designers of these new vehicles and have them innovate in tandem with built environment practitioners who can sort of co-design the built environment in conjunction with the vehicles and the services. So that's mobility-oriented development. And I wanted to just end just with some initial ideas. And people in this room collectively definitely know probably a lot more than I do about how what I just talked about might apply in the Valley. But I wanted to just give a little bit of a spark for thinking around this and returning to the kind of breakdown of the projects that we have, which may or may not be applicable. But if we kind of just look at mobility as a service, you've already got bike share, WeCycle is available and already providing extension to public transit. There's a BRT system, which is a pretty rare thing to have in a town in the Valley of cities of this size. The downtowner operates for free downtown. And Highway 82 you could see as kind of a trunk line, meaning a lot of the public transit agencies in other cities are trying to figure out how to get more people to high-frequency trunk lines because frequency drives tremendous ridership because it leads to higher reliability of the service in terms of people's perception. So if there's like 3 to 5 minute wait time, you're not looking at the bus schedule, you just show up to the stop and you know it's gonna come pretty soon. That's why Uber and Lyft have worked so well. There's a 2 to 3 minute wait time, right? So in order to do that, economically, you have to move to these high-frequency trunk lines and get rid of the sort of branches and leave those more to on-demand services potentially. At least that's the way a lot of cities are going. But in the Valley, you've already got a trunk line. It's Highway 82. So now you've got this opportunity to maybe pilot first and last mile solutions, run some autonomous vehicle circulators into, I don't know, Basalt, Carbondale. Carbondale already runs a circulator, but some of these private services could be really interesting there. On interoperable transit data, RAFTA already publishes real-time data, which is, again, a rare thing for a transit agency to do. Already has an app through which they publish a lot of their data. And I understand that they're actually starting to work with Trillium, one of our partners in the data consortium, to start to publish the data in a way that would make it more user-friendly in terms of Google consuming that data and making it available to users, Google Transit app and others. So there's kind of an interesting head start in a way in terms of what RAFTA is doing with data. Fleet electrification, the Canary Initiative has set a goal of 80% CO2 reduction by 2050, I believe. Not all cities have goals like that, and I think that can really help drive some of the electrification approaches. On autonomous vehicles, this is kind of fun to think about. I don't know if it's something that would be attractive to the vehicle companies themselves, which is the critical thing. These Waymo, which is Google's autonomous vehicle service, GM's autonomous vehicles, even some of the smaller startups, they need to see market potential in coming to a place to demonstrate their services. Would they see that in Aspen? I'm not sure. I hope so. But there are, in terms of just the infrastructure, there's already low-speed thoroughfares that are dedicated to bicycles and pedestrians that are pretty wide. It's a low-speed city in general, so relatively low-risk area to demonstrate some of these services. And then there's potentially high exposure to service companies who come to Aspen because there's so many visitors. So they would kind of see some of these services and maybe bring that back home. That's all hypothetical, but where it would really be proven out is whether the companies might respond and be interested in coming. And then in terms of mobility-oriented development, which I already mentioned, the width of the streets, and the city has already started doing some of this, reclaiming parking spots to put sort of restaurant tables and things out there and modify. That's kind of a version of tactical urbanism. And I think you could amp that up a little bit to try some more potentially bold experiments like cutting off parts of the city and reclaiming them for people for a weekend or a week or something like that in conjunction with a festival. So there could be some really interesting ways to work through the mobility-oriented development pieces there as well. And that's all I have. Yeah. And I think we have time. Yeah, we're doing Q&A, so there's 2 microphones on either side here if anybody has questions, or just yell if you're loud. That works too. Hi, thanks. Yeah.
I have a question on your Austin project.
Yeah.
Did those companies that got together for the shuttle, did they pay for it together? Did they group pay for it?
Yeah.
How did you make sense then to do that? Because the question you're asking, is the commute into town. So if you had a lot of construction and traffic with trucks and things like that, if you have companies that are grouping together to pay for a shuttle, that could really be a problem. So how did you get them to turn on to that?
Really good question. So we had to sort of break down, in a way, we had to sort of break down the market segment to the most likely adopters. And in this case, the most likely adopters are those who are facing pain points around growth, particularly related to parking. So Whole Foods pays about $200 per employee per month for parking, and that was kind of the starting point to create an actual return on investment. In other words, if we can deliver a service that is less than $200 per employee per month to avoid that parking spot, then they gain, there's a return on investment for them. So we were kind of lucky in that regard. And Austin's growing really quickly, so they're not only already paying $200 per employee per month, but they're looking to invest. And parking spots in downtown parking structure can run about 20 grand per spot capital cost. And they're looking at expanding. They're having a lot of growth and new employees coming in, and they're looking at investing in some new parking structures. So if you can completely avoid the investment in the new parking structure, take that money you would have invested and do it to avoid the need for parking in the first place, that's where the real economic benefits start to accrue. But in general, I don't want to say that it's only companies that are facing pain points around parking that would be applicable. I think there are companies, and a couple of our interested employers now are those who actually aren't facing pain points around parking. They see it as a recruitment benefit. So they've got a slightly younger demographic that they're hiring from, and they see it as a boon to their recruitment capabilities to be able to offer non-car oriented transportation. So if somebody comes in to apply for a job and they're saying especially millennials are generally shifting away from car ownership, right? So if you're hiring among a lot of millennials and they're used to places like Boston and New York and DC where you don't really need a car, and then they come to Austin and somebody's like, yeah, sorry, you're gonna need a car to get to work. They're like, really? What kind of thing? Why? So they see it as a tremendous way to increase their recruitment pool by being able to offer those benefits. And then there are the companies that see it as a reputational benefit. There are companies that realize that there's a labor productivity increase if they can provide Wi-Fi on the buses. So the broad answer is I think you just have to look at the interests of the individual companies, figure out what's valuable to them, and then deliver the services in a way that will offer that value. And yeah, again, I wouldn't want to limit it just to the pain points around parking, but that's a really obvious starting point if there is something like that that's a direct bottom line impact that that they would try to fix.
So, Greg, you talked about the package of mobility services in Austin. There's probably some kind of a package that will work for this valley. For example, it might consist of BRT, ride sharing, ride hailing, which services we talked a lot about with our last speaker, and maybe even dynamic pricing. Those are just hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we figure out which package, which combination works for us? Is there a way to model that so we don't have to do a lot of dry runs that are expensive and very fun?
Yes, I think there is a way to get an initial idea, and we're actually in the process of designing our second pilot, or I guess selecting our second pilot in Austin. And part of what we're doing is looking at looking at corridors that are highly trafficked and that have a lot of congestion, because the people who travel along those, again, might be willing to try something different. And then the houses adjacent to those corridors, we can start breaking down in terms of demographics. So if there's a 2+ car household, they might be more likely to adopt a commuting service and get rid of one of those cars. If it's a 1-car household, that might be a little bit less likely, right? And then there's demographic targeting that we can do as well. So as I mentioned, there is a general trend, and this isn't as true in Austin as it is elsewhere, but millennials are generally shifting away from car ownership and are much more open to adopting these types of services. So that's an interesting target market. That's in terms of just looking at who might be the most likely to adopt, and then geographically concentrating those groups. So if there are areas where a lot of those groups live and they're concentrated in one place, like a condo complex or something like that, that could be a really interesting way to get an initial idea whether there would be likelihood of adoption. And then one of the things we're doing in Austin now is collecting a lot of origin destination data. And that can come from apps like Waze. It can be self-reported. It's something that cities collect. It's something that transit agencies collect. And if you can get a sense of where people are traveling, where they're starting, where they're ending, and concentrate a lot of those end trips, you start to get an idea where there might be demand, obviously, for some of those trips, especially at peak times when you can guess that people are sitting in traffic a lot and are facing undesirable conditions and might be willing to try something different. Then the obvious, I guess the third thing, the obvious answer would be looking for employers who would be willing to subsidize this. And once you get a sense of whether that employer has employees who fit some of those demographic profiles that you might look at initially, or not just demographic profiles, but likelihood of adoption information, you can get a sense of whether the employer themselves is facing a pain point, or whether they would see a reputational benefit in offering some of these, or whether they'd see recruitment benefits in some of it. But we talk a lot about like B2B versus B2C, and the B2B is the key part, because employers are your access point to lots of different riders. You can't go out to riders individually as efficiently as you can to employers. So we have that B2B model that says, do you, the employer, see value in this? And then it's almost a separate question to determine the likelihood of success of the service once you launch it, because the employers don't really know. They're hoping that their employees will use it, but they don't really know. So if you can do some of that market profiling to determine the likelihood of success, that's kind of the winning combination. It's kind of a complicated answer, but hopefully.
What you just said kind of brings me to my question. You identified those communities that might be interested in giving up their personal vehicles, but Americans generally associate a lot of value and status to own vehicles.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Texas, certainly. So how do you convince the guy who has his souped-up F-150 or the Land Rover owner who insists on driving a child to school in those great public buses and school buses?
Yeah, good question. And of course, we're not in the business of going out and preaching and trying to get people to try something we want it to be value driven. We want it to be an active choice that people can make where they actually see it as an improvement to their current situation, such as getting out of traffic. So if that's somebody who has a souped up F-150 and uses a commuting service a couple times a week, good. If that's somebody with 2 cars and they think they can sell one of them and then use the commuting service to sort of supplement that one car, good. But we're not trying to tackle everything at once. I think as you see the autonomous services become more ubiquitous, it really will become a more reliable and cost-effective service. So in these early days, just like in the early days of any new technology like the Prius, there's like early adopters who are really excited about it, or they're facing more pain than others in terms of how this new technology could fix their situation. So we focus on those and kind of segment the market that way. And then once those services get established among that early group, we can hopefully move out to make the case to those who are maybe a little more difficult in terms of having to take kids to like households with a lot of kids. That might not be an early market, for example. And somebody who's really enthusiastic about their vehicle might not be an early market either. And then they can coexist too. You're still going to have personally owned vehicles as these services become more available. But when we look at the value proposition, especially the economic value proposition, it seems like there is a tremendous drive that will, an economic driver for making this shift. So that's what we're trying to kind of kickstart. But where it ends up and whether it goes across every rural area in America with every truck owner, I don't know. You know? Okay, how about this side?
This is my first time visit to this conversation, although I've lived in this valley for 40 years. Been a participant in a lot of transportation and planning efforts, have learned a lot, know many of the leaders of the Roaring Fork Valley and beyond, leadership through Roaring Fork leadership and other kinds of things. I remember noting back in 1992 when Aspen said, we're not going to have more than, I'm going to say, I thought it was 22,000 cars coming over one of the bridges up here. And I thought back then, and I followed this issue for a long time, and that is this valley has to solve these problems. And I'm sorry I haven't been to one of these conversations. But I also enjoy a lot of curiosity. I have a nephew, Dan Sturgis, who at age 55, I'm told, is an elder in the debate about autonomous vehicles. Dan is very much a person that has converted from individual vehicles to autonomous vehicles. But let me go back to what this issue is about. It's about a region. It's about a Highway 82 that in the past has been described by, I think, John Bennett as a series of pearls. And those were communities. And that's when we really started on the building of RAFTA, the Railroad Holding Authority, and it's all come together. But I want to just raise a question with the conversation that you focus on that's coming in 2 months. It's called Glenwood Springs Grand Avenue Bridge. And I'm really proud that the mayor up here heard from the manager down in Glenwood Springs that said, oh, yeah, I guess we better get prepared for that, because when you're going to have the kind of congestion in Glenwood for 3 months, you've got an opportunity to get the conversation going with the employers in the Upper Valley to look at these questions. What are you going to do about it? I'm just saying that's going to be a learning experience. I described this once to somebody today, that's going to be an exercise. She said, you're very diplomatic. I said, I always try to be diplomatic. But when Aspen screams or feel they're heard all around the world. And I want to encourage this conversation to include a full Roaring Fork Valley communication and discussion. I think everything that you talked about today is a conversation that we should all be in now. This will be a short opportunity, but quite a painful exercise. But the momentum is here. The intent is here. We have to bring in some of the largest employers into this conversation, because I think when you get to mobility-oriented design, that's where we have to go. We can't build our way out of this problem of congestion with more concrete. So thank you. It was very worth it for me to hear, and I'm encouraging a lot of people up and down this valley, get involved.
Thank you, yeah. And I'll just say, I think the kind of opportunity you bring up in terms of the Grand Avenue Bridge being, again, that's kind of a pain point. You know, people will be sitting in congestion and kind of wondering whether there's a different way to do this. That's been used in the past in other cities as a way to do a two-week run of a different type of service, for example, that you offer as an alternative, do a big promotion push to let people know that there's this other way to get through that area, whether it's a shuttle or some other, you know, free TNC rides, for example, free Uber and Lyft rides that they can try to avoid congestion, things like that. So these temporary sort of pain points that really put a kink in people's routine, that's when they're likely to kind of start thinking, okay, wow, what, and then try something and then maybe it sticks, right? So that is a big opportunity. And then the other point you brought up around employer engagement, I think is really huge, and we talked a little bit about that. And that could maybe be a combination. Maybe employers would sponsor the deployment of an alternative service during that period when people are likely to adopt it. And then again, maybe those people realize that that's something that they'd want to continue to do. And one last sort of, I guess, kernel I'll offer is something that Capital Metro, our partner transit agency in Austin, does, which they call transit adventures. And this is something that a lot of transit agencies do. But the idea is just to get people through a trip once. So they have kind of hosts that take them from, if it's an employer that does it, which is again a really great way to start, maybe you take your employees to lunch. And instead of driving their cars to lunch, you use transit and you connect that transit to another mode. Let's say you go to a car-to-go and then you all go together in like a shared car. And just by going along on the ride and like realizing that it's possible and sitting down, the auto companies talk a lot about butts and seats. If you can get butts and seats, people might actually think of that as something they can do. They can start to imagine it. So transit adventures are another tool, and I think combining them with something that's like a construction project that will be a big pain point, and then employer engagement, that can be a really interesting way to get started. Pam.
Hi. I was hoping you could share your thoughts about, in the next decade and beyond things like modular cities, but actually how people, especially in the Roaring Fork Valley, are likely to be working compared to your experience in Austin with the shared economy taking off, not just with Uber and Lyft, where people who work in those companies have extreme flexibility in when they choose to work. And so for applications or apps like TaskRabbit or Thumbtack or other things that enable people who are working more in a service economy. I don't have the data about the Roaring Fork Valley about how much is manufacturing, how much is more on demand where you can choose the time you go to your job. Do you see that? Are you looking at how that can impact the future for us here?
We're not looking at it directly in Austin, but we have a partner who is, and they're, I mentioned them earlier, Movability Austin, which is the Transportation Management Association. And there's another consultancy called Thrival that works on a whole category called Transportation Demand Management. And the idea there is basically, well, in its most simple form, it's just telecommuting and avoiding trips to and from work. Then the next layer above that is kind of spreading out the peaks. So if you have your workers everyone showing up at 9 o'clock, spreading out the time at which they would come into work and incentivizing that differently. And you can imagine with a more on-demand kind of sharing economy model where you might be moving away from models that are strictly 9 to 5, that can really do a lot to address those big pain point times at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m.
Just
so I
one
think
quick
it's a
question about
yeah.
like Trillium. Do they have the kind of data that actually tracks not just traffic movement, but how people are employed, or are there ways to create those kinds of linked packages where we are looking at, how I know some of your colleagues took 4 different ways to get to the Denver airport, or maybe 5 public transports. And
Right.
How soon do you see that happening so that it's just really seamless and you just request something in Aspen and you are at the Denver airport and it doesn't require as much management as it does now?
Right, and you'll see pockets of it, just like the advent of any of these new technologies, you'll see pockets of it among early adopters. And I'd say it's really close to something like that already, where the data is actually starting to become more ubiquitous. Companies like Google and Apple are getting access to better and better data sets. Uber, very critically, is, I think, showing some signs of being willing to share their data. There's a World Bank-sponsored effort called the Open Transport Partnership that's really opened up a lot of Uber's data. So there's a move toward greater availability, and you notice that I'm going to the data question as the basis of that answer, because the availability of the data is what allows users to plan their trips reliably and understand where services are available on an on-demand basis. So I think we're very close to getting to something where you can plan those multimodal trips. There are certain markets where you can already do that, I would say, and early adopters who are really savvy with these different apps, who can switch among different apps, because that's what they have to do right now. But eventually there will be, I think, and there are companies working on this, one called Ride Scout, and they've become Movable North America. They've got a partnership in Portland with Portland TriMet, and they are a multimodal trip planner. Google has recently added Uber and Lyft to their platforms, but you still get kicked over to the Uber and Lyft app, right? So it's not fully seamless, but there are savvy users who can already weave those modes together and do it. And I think the more you get those early adopters to start using it, and the more companies see value in sharing that data, the more possible that future will become.
Yes, Greg, I noticed that there was something missing in the presentation, and that is where government plays
Yeah.
role.
Yeah.
And there are people here that, are leaders on planning commissions and like the ideas and want to know how to present it or get it, as you say, written in the code books.
Yeah.
It seems your focus is on businesses changing the way people think and the way they live. Is there a place for government, people on planning commissions or city councils or county commissioners that can help this? Or where is our role?
Absolutely, absolutely. So our main change model at RMI is kind of led by business for profit. That's the major sort of vector for creating these transformations, and then looking for the economic drivers that can be there. But governments are critical in creating the enabling conditions for that. And I mentioned before, when we were looking at our city selection process, we worked with the Austin City Council, the chair of the Mobility Committee, various stakeholders within the community to understand whether there was an environment that could enable those types of services to proliferate more quickly. And Austin really exhibited a lot of that willingness. Already had Google working in the city, for example, and had worked with them to create kind of a more predictable regulatory framework around autonomous vehicles. So things like that. And then mobility-oriented development. What I presented today is really kind of our next move with mobility-oriented development. But our whole first year of effort in Austin was actually working on the city codes. So we worked with the city planners and various people involved in a huge effort going on in Austin right now called Code Next, which was revising the city codes. And city codes are a critical enabler of moving toward revised urban form, as I had mentioned before. So planning commissions, city councils, et cetera, are right in the heart of creating amenable land use codes to allow developers and financiers who don't see that risk timeline to create these different types of urban form. And a perfect example is minimum parking requirements. That's probably the most infamous example. So developers will come in and say, we think we have a demographic that we can serve that doesn't want to own cars, we don't need parking. Parking adds $20,000 to the cost of an apartment. So it's a very significant cost to who you'd ultimately view as purchasing one of these condominiums. And the codes are what force the developers to add that $20,000 price tag. And then you end up with people who would have bought it, but it's $20,000 out of their price range because they also have to own a vehicle, which is another, that's like $14,000 a year. So you end up creating urban form that isn't equitable and kind of targets a particular, or serves a particular income level. So those kinds of systemic effects from city codes are really important to recognize, and I think the cities that can get out ahead of that, and the cities that have, so Portland has very forward-thinking city codes, Denver just went through Blueprint 2020, Austin is in the process of creating one, but you can directly correlate the advent of new mobility services, the degree of economic stratification within neighborhoods, and other effects that are really egregious to the overall economic health of a community to land use codes. So I'd say that's A critical enabling factor that we're still working on, that's in a public comment process right now, and we're providing some analysis, and we're hoping that some of these tactical urbanism pilots can provide demonstration to the people who are working on that city code. And that's just one example. So with mobility as a service, when we ran our pilot, we had to get clearance from the city to operate as a common carrier service. So they had to license that service. With fleet electrification, which is one of the projects I didn't go into, the city council passed a resolution to electrify their municipal fleet. So they've actually got a government mandate to electrify all their vehicles. And we're hoping to work with them on a business model where they would make those vehicles available to non-car owning TNC drivers, similar to the model I talked a little bit about earlier, where TNC drivers would have access to an electric vehicle on a temporary basis and unlock some of the cost savings of those vehicles relative to what a fossil fuel vehicle would be. So the municipal, you can imagine, if it goes all the way, the municipal government owns electric vehicles that they don't use very often. That's the thing, they're pretty low utilization vehicles. So make those available to TNC drivers while you're not using them. Maybe it's just overnight to start with. And there's a lot of demand for rides in Austin overnight, especially on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And then you can earn some revenue as the city on some of the ride. You could take a cut off those rides during those times. And then autonomous vehicles is probably the most applicable example in terms of government involvement because it requires a lot of clearance from a regulatory perspective and also allocating particular corridors or zones of the city where you actually will allow an autonomous vehicle to operate. So it kind of is a thread that runs through all of our work. And we've got what we're calling, it's called a co-development agreement. So we've got an official kind of memorandum of understanding with the city that's signed by the mayor and signed by our managing director. So it is a partnership with the municipal government in addition to those other communities and organizations. So yeah, hopefully those are some examples of the way the government could play a role, but I'd be happy to offer more detail, as a follow-up as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So it seems as though we're living in an age which is good for what you're trying to do, where there are a lot of private services that want to deliver us on demand and private companies that are prepared to deliver products. And so what you've done is to try to aggregate them and then to aggregate demand through employers. Mm-hmm. But we live in a valley where we value small buildings and small spaces, and we don't have a lot of big employers because we have small spaces. So. Mm-hmm. I'm curious whether there are other communities or if you have any other ideas on how to do that side of your business model, which is how do we aggregate demand enough to attract these private companies? Ironically, the area of demand that we have the most to offer would be the trunk line, and we're doing great on the trunk line, but you don't want to turn that over to a private company. So yeah, that was the model right there. You're aggregating all these services,
right?
But we don't have big enough employers to do what you've done in Austin. So
right, and Whole Foods is a big employer, so that's a totally fair assessment. But some of these other guys are pretty small, and GSD&M came on with Whole Foods. They're about 1/10 the employee count of Whole Foods. And we started to view Whole Foods as kind of the anchor of the service, that we could allow smaller businesses who might not be in a position to pay for a service themselves to tack themselves onto. So we've worked on a loose contracting structure where we can allow some of these other, and these guys are pretty small too, and they already run their own shuttle. They're pretty big. That's actually Expedia now. They were bought by Expedia. But even if you don't have the anchor, if you get enough of the smaller employers together, a big part of what we were trying to figure out is just the mechanics of doing a contract with multiple employers. And these guys didn't have anything like that. They said, well, we haven't worked with one contract for multiple employers before. So we were kind of learning as we went, and we think we've made some progress to where we could use some of those same contract templates and approaches to bring some of the smaller employers together. So that's how I would look for an anchor tenant if you can, but if all you have is a bunch of smaller employers, a bunch of these guys, and not a lot of these, get enough of them together, you'll build enough critical mass, and then you can create you can pull in enough interest from the likes of these companies. And the RFP is the ultimate test, right? If you put that request for proposal out and say, hey, we've got 10 small companies that want a service, here's what it would need to do, here's what you need to deliver, and you set those requirements, you'll get responses that will indicate to you whether there's interest within within that group. And they'll probably give you feedback if they're not interested. And that's the other thing. There's not a lot of RFPs going out to these companies. We talk a lot about the advent of these new services, and everybody's heard of a lot of these companies, but there just isn't a lot of solicitation from employers for their services. So there's an opportunity to pursue them, I would say. Okay. That might be all the questions. Well, we've got one more.
I went to visit my niece in DC, and she did a program that the people started. No help from the government, no help from transportation. It was called slugging.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
How does that fit into this program?
Well, actually, we were just talking about this earlier with John and Bill in the green room, because there's an article that just came out, I think from CBS that you were talking about this morning. Yeah. And this is something this is probably one of the earliest forms of ride sharing it wasn't called that, but people were motivated to save time because they could go into the HOV lane with additional riders. So the driver's incentivized to pick someone up, and then if you don't have a car, you can just be out there and slugging. And there's people got used to it. It's safe. It was something that people actually used quite a bit. So it's still going on, and I would say it's an inspiration for some of the services that we're trying. So there's a company called Split that allows you to do something very similar with an app where you bring riders in and they basically split the costs of gas, and it's on a particular commute. It might be, so it's kind of more of a formal mechanism to bring people in. Slugging is just right along the side of the road, and I think it's awesome. I mean, I applaud the make it work kind of attitude around that, and the fact that you don't need an app, you don't need a bunch of data. Just stand there and look at all these empty cars going by and get in one of them. That works too,
It was a little more formal than that.
Yeah.
I thought it was a really good system. It really worked in DC.
Yeah, I didn't mean to, that's not quite how it works. I think it's more formal than that, especially now. I think it's gotten pretty tight. So, yeah, good model.
One more, thanks. I just wanted to say I really appreciated what Mr. Sturgis was saying. I hope everybody heard the discussion about the Glenwood Bridge closure this summer is going to have a huge impact. RAFT is anticipating 1 to 2 hour wait just to get off of I-70 into Glenwood and on to 82 and to your destination. We're looking at a 1 to 2 hour wait to get into our valley due to this closure.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing and hearing here is that you've got all these great solutions, and what I'm thinking the commuters in the valley, from here in the fashionable West End, Rifle, or whatever we want to call it, the commuters lack is willpower or understanding to make the change. And I'm wondering if people actually have an idea of what it's costing them to sit in their car or their big truck or whatever to get up here. And can we somehow quantify that for them and let them understand this is costing you $100 a day or $50, whatever it is, to sit here? Because if there's an economic incentive tied to what their behavior is, maybe that would help. And I'm thinking the gridlock that we're going to see this summer is an opportunity for entrepreneurs, business people. I'm assuming it's all of your workers, the people in this valley's workers, who are going to be delayed, and the cost is going to be significant. And I think there's an opportunity for businesses like this perhaps to step in. We've actually made entrees to Amtrak to see if Amtrak could help put train service back.
That's interesting, yeah.
From Rifle to Glenwood, at least, to get them onto this side of the bridge.
Yeah.
And who knows, the cost of that could be $500,000 or more. So I'm thinking there's money there, and there's incentive. And if people have a personal incentive and they can save money personally by trying something new, as you've suggested, just to get them to try it once, this may be the opportunity this summer.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping everybody understands that this could be, this curse of this bridge closure could really make an opportunity for us.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree. I mean, I think if people can be made aware of it early on and understand that there's going to be this period where, you know, they need to make some alternate plans, and then also while they're experiencing this less than ideal situation, if they understand what some of the alternatives are, that can be, you know, a really great entry point to say, hey, next time there's this other service available. And I wouldn't claim to know the solution here, but it's worth a brainstorming session, certainly. I think there's enough energy in this room that it merits probably a follow-up with some of the other, you know, people who are interested in it. Quickly, on Dan Sturgis, I want to make sure I mention this because he is working with us on our mobility-oriented development project. Not working with us officially, but I ran into him at the Amazon conference. So I mentioned Amazon is getting into transportation. Ran into him there, and we've spoken to him a few times in the past. And he has a really interesting model of tiering the vehicles and services for different urban forms. So this would be a neighborhood. This would be tier 1 in Dan's kind of conception of it, which would be more amenable to neighborhood electric vehicles or low-speed electric vehicles that have lower safety requirements, are much more efficient, and get people around with much less infrastructure requirement than a huge vehicle that's designed to go, you know, 90 miles an hour on an interstate would be, which he calls tier 2. And then there's tier 3, which is actually, I think, is airline travel. So the idea of custom tailoring the services and vehicles to the neighborhood is a big part of our thinking with this mod city approach, because you're bringing two industries that aren't really working together, the built environment industry and the vehicle and service industries. Vehicle and service industries are working together. Uber and GM and Lyft and GM, and Uber's working with major auto manufacturers too. So they've kind of started to collaborate, but the built environment is still over here kind of not really working a lot with the vehicle industry. And then vehicle companies, I don't think you'd find very many architects on staff, but that's the kind of collaboration that we think could unlock a lot more of this value and have custom tailored services for the neighborhood. So just wanted to mention that about Dan Sturgis as well. Okay.
One significant segment of traffic on 82 every day are service vehicles and tradespeople who typically have larger vehicles, maybe, you know, higher usage of energy, carrying tools that they need possibly at different locations day to day, maybe multiple locations in the same day.
Right.
You know, what thoughts do you have on, you know, how to help, you know, this segment reduce, you know, their vehicle usage?
Yeah, great question. And it gets to the souped up F-150 question earlier. There's particular groups that are going to be harder to, whose needs are going to be harder to meet with this kind of on-demand approach. But imagine, and this is just to noodle on. I mean, this isn't a solution that we've actually vetted. But imagine that you had, so there's something called Uber Cargo. I think Pam mentioned TaskRabbit, which are these different approaches to getting, well, I'll start with Uber Cargo, which is a way of delivering goods within the urban environment from point A to point B. And you don't have to be there for the pickup. You don't have to be there for the drop-off. It's to do last mile delivery within dense urban areas where, again, a huge UPS truck isn't the right vehicle to do that. But an Uber vehicle that's taking someone along that route anyway might be a really interesting way to get that package into a dense urban area, right? So that is kind of happening in parallel. There's this freight movement on-demand system emerging. Amazon, as you've probably seen, is working on autonomous drones that can deliver stuff in urban areas. So there's this whole world of freight delivery. And what sparked that for me was you're talking about tools that need to be in a certain place at a certain time. The tools don't need to be in the car with you at the same time that you're driving. The tools need to be at the work site, right? So get the tools at the work site at the time they need to be at the work site, get the people to the work site at the time they need to be at the work site, match them up, use software to do all this matching. You can imagine a future in which you'd be able to move the goods and all the other tools that people need probably more effectively than you can now, especially larger tools and things that you can't even move with a truck. You know, there's a whole world of possibility there that I think is just on the brink of being explored. And it has to do with combining these two, like moving people and moving goods. But we're starting to see it come along, so. Okay, thanks everybody.